So, hello everyone. I'm Divya Kumari, working with Entrepreneurs Ecole, who is a leading organization with the mission to boost the success of startups and enhance ecosystem performance globally. Since inception, it has provided advisory services in over 22 countries across 6 continents, establishing itself as a trusted partner in entrepreneurship. We specialize in strategic consultation, education and capacity building service, mentorship and networking programs, and entrepreneurial skills trainings of diverse institutions, including schools, NGOs, universities, incubation centers, youth club, and associations. Today, you all have joined us in Entrepreneurs Ecole Skill Development Journalism, which is a 16-week hands-on training course offers an immersive experience with our guest speakers from the industry, practical assignments, and real-world insights. It's an excellent opportunity to enhance your journalistic abilities and network with the professionals across the globe. So today, on our EESD journalism webinar titled From War to Satire and AI, we have with us Mr. Neil McCat, sorry, Mr. Neil McCat, sorry, if I'm okay,
McCafferty, I'll explain it.
McCafferty. Mr. Neil McCafferty, he's an award-winning journalist and media consultant. He has over 35 years of experience, and he's a senior product at Pilot Media Initiatives. He's a former BBC senior journalism instructor, expert in media training and broadcasting. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, sorry, my name is very difficult to pronounce. It's actually an Irish name, so don't worry, even I get it wrong sometimes. So it's quite good. Well, thank you for inviting me this afternoon. Very briefly, a little bit of background on myself. As you mentioned, worked in the industry for an awful long time. In fact, all of my career since leaving school. So since leaving secondary school, in other words, high school. And I spent a lot of time with the BBC doing various things. And this will all become relevant in a moment. I started in BBC local radio, which is, I mean, most of you will be familiar with the BBC's services, the World Service, BBC World News, and other things. It does an awful lot in the UK alone. And amongst them, it runs a chain of 39 local radio, the original radio stations, basically. They still exist today, but at the time they were very much, they were thriving. They had very large audiences, and they were also very good places to start a career, because one of the things that was very useful there, which I find even to this day very useful, was the fact that you had to do everything. So there was no demarcation between various roles and functions. Is that you worked in that environment, you would be expected to do everything. Operate your own equipment, write your own news, present programs, do the whole thing. And that, at the time, was quite unusual. However, it's now become, as you're seeing, it's now becoming the norm. And it's one of the things which I'm always incredibly grateful for, was starting in that environment, because that is something which, before, if you as much as touched the fax machine, you could cause a strike. It was that bad at one point, up to about 35 years ago. If you, as an editorial person, walked in and operated a piece of equipment, you would end up with people outside the front door waving placards. Unions would cause problems, all sorts. Let alone when we've gone further down the timeline and we've started saying, okay, now pick up a camera and go film your own news. Now that was quite a radical move, bearing in mind up to that point, everything had been done with professional camera operators. And it was simply because as an industry, we were working in a way, we had not adapted the way that we worked from when news was originally shot on film. So from local radio, you go to regional television, which again is a city-based news service. And the difficulty then was, again, getting used to the fact that technology was moving so fast that we were not moving with it. And so there came a point when it was okay, pick up. It was a small Sony camera, which actually changed the industry, called the DVX 1000. That suddenly you could start giving them out to journalists and reporters, and you could go out on your own and film basic TV news packages, which is very much the nucleus of what people call Mojo today, mobile journalism. It all started then. So that's why I'm actually very appreciative of coming from that particular background, is that it's always been multi-skilled. You had a key skill that you always stuck to. It's always been multi-skilled. It's always been multi-layered. And it's also something which has changed rapidly over time. So I often I explain to my son about, okay, when we started, we were on typewriters. I mean, we were actually the end of we're going from the end of the typewriter age right now into the AI age. And having seen all of that across time, across large organizations, has been quite incredible. But the real reason I'm talking to you today is most of my a lot of the last few years I've spent working in something called media development, as well as frontline journalism as well. Now, media development is, I'm not sure how many of you have heard the term before, but it's basically, well, there are two ways of describing it. One of them is assisting countries in transition to develop their media industries. That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is Western donors interfering in media ecosystems in developing countries, and any description in between. So this is quite a substantial industry. There are several large organizations around the world who pursue this, and also a number of smaller ones. But what it essentially entails is running various projects on various themes in various parts of the world. So my introduction into that was bizarrely in Kosovo in 1999. I'm assuming you all remember or have some knowledge of the Kosovo conflict. So just very, very briefly, the Balkans in the 1990s, there was a string of localized, very vicious conflicts, notably in Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and a few other bits as well. Generally to do with the breakup of what was then known as Yugoslavia, and the dominant partner in there was Serbia. So to cut a very long story short, NATO decided belatedly to intervene when there was a series of ethnic cleansing took place inside Kosovo between ethnic Serbs and Albanians. So Albanians there made up the bulk of the population, and the Serbs tried to drive them out, which they actually did at one point, pushing them towards Macedonia and Albania. NATO then decided to intervene with a bombing campaign targeting the Serb army, Serb government, and Serbia. It was quite quick. It lasted, remember rightly, 60 days. And eventually the Serbian leader, a guy called Slobodan Milosevic, decided to withdraw. He didn't actually cede Kosovo, but he decided to withdraw his forces from Kosovo to allow a peacekeeping force to take the province over. And that's it. It happened relatively suddenly. There was no actual ground troop involvement. It was all a bombing campaign. And into the mess came me accidentally. So I had gone for another job at the BBC World Service, and had gone for an interview, and quite frankly, made a mess of it. And afterwards, I went to the bar because I was waiting for my train home. I live a long way from London. And the BBC buildings then had fantastic bars, clubs, they were called, the BBC Club, where I went in there to have a drink, wait for my train. And I ran in to a former boss, a guy I'd worked with for several years. And I was just basically crying into my beer what an absolute balls up I'd made of this board. And what then happened? He then turned around and says, "Well, I've got a job for you. Why don't you come and work for me?" And he was involved in a project which the British government had started, which was to try to find indigenous Albanian broadcasters to start up a radio and TV station inside Kosovo once the military action had finished. So I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. I'll do that then. So I accidentally, I'm not joking. It was that 4 or 5 beers later, we were fixing up with my boss to let me go. The BBC has a system where you can go off to other departments for several months at a time, something called an attachment, and they were basically doing deals on the phone. And I was on a plane to Macedonia 2 days later. And then it gets interesting because, okay, I was there, not as a it wasn't the original plan for me to be there at all, and actually I had very little expertise in that in the broadcasting sector. Fine, that's easy. Setting up broadcasters after other people have blown them up was not necessarily my skill set, and so we had to work out very, very rapidly how to go about this. And also, my colleague who I was working with was there again. We're both solid broadcasters, except we had no idea on operating in war zones and post-conflict zones, and what we were going to find. And we actually did the one thing that we knew how to do, which is to run with our instincts. So the first thing was, and this is all very presumptuous because nobody at the time knew the exact timetable for the conflict ending, that we knew it was coming to an end one way or another. And the donor agencies, in this case, the British governments, the American government, Canadian government, basically the NATO governments, were being deluged with requests for help, for money, for technical assistance. There would be quite a substantial reconstruction effort because obviously having bombed it, you are therefore responsible for putting it back together again. And we were working with people from the development sector. In other words, people from the development agency. In the case of us, it was DFID, the Department for International Development. They were kind of like all over the place when it came to this because, again, their skill set was in refugees, food aid, dealing with conflict trauma, that sort of thing, not with broadcasters. So suddenly all of us are sat there and we are completely clueless as to what to do. And the instinct the development people had was, no, we have this budget. The budget was quite a bit. It was about $10 million. We have this budget and we need to spend it and we need to get something going. What do you mean by something going? And their initial idea was to draw in all these groups that they had applications from and just start distributing the cash and saying, some for you, there's some for you, and there's some for you. Here's a couple of million for you. And we said, no, don't do that. Whatever you do, don't do that. We need to back a winner. We want to get hold of the best people we can. We want to get hold of the most credible group that we can lay our hands on and work with them. And that's, so we just binned everybody else. We binned all of the stuff. And it's okay, let's see who we can find. And it turns out there was such a group. They'd existed for many years. They were made up of some people who'd worked for the government-controlled radio and TV station RTK in Kosovo, and had been sacked years ago because they were Albanians, and had set up on their own and set up one of the first ever, I would describe as guerrilla-based radio stations. They were broadcasting online. However, had a presence. They were already well known amongst the community. And we basically one night went for a meeting in a cafe with them. And we knew from the get-go, these are the people that we wanted to work with without anybody else involved. The basic principle is back the winner, find your horses, because these, we said, how long would it take us once we got inside Pristina to get this baby up and running? And I said, okay, if it took us more than 4 days, sack us. So they were going to go from, being refugees in Macedonia to running a radio station in 4 days, and we were going to help them. And that's where we kicked in. And this all the time, people they were very critical of us, and it upset a lot of people. But we said, if you're going to do this, you're going to spray the money too thinly. You need to build something which is going to be a success from the get-go. And if you don't make it work from the start, it will just fall over and fail, and it will go absolutely nowhere. So we started. We had a few days to put a plan together, and suddenly our backgrounds came into it, because we were suddenly involved in everything, into planning a program schedule, to getting involved in setting up the transmission chain, and building studios and goodness knows what else. So we suddenly had to get to, had to really roll up our sleeves, say, right, here's your program schedule from something that doesn't exist at the moment. Where are your presenters? Let's get the journalists. Let's get the people who are going to be working on them. Let's get this going. And so we were able to put together a program schedule. We had to, lots of issues over distribution. So what had happened was NATO had very kindly bombed all of the transmission stations, which was very kind of them, because we wanted them. But they'd taken them out because they were carrying communications for the Serb army. So we suddenly found ourselves. So we promised them a national or province-wide broadcaster. For context, Kosovo is roughly the size of Switzerland or Wales, if that gives you an idea of the landmass to cover. Mostly flat, but not totally. So not too much terrain, but without the main transmission stations, we were in a mess. So again, you go and call in the expertise that you need. There are people who we can say, right, we want to do this from here. We want to cover this area, and we want to do it as efficiently as possible. So they all run away, program the coordinates in, and then tell us exactly what we need. And the thing was, with when we were moving into Pristina, was we had going into a thing called the Relindia building, which was the highest building inside Kosovo. And I don't know how familiar you all are with, I'm not guessing not much, but with FM transmission systems, but they're really easy. They're line of sight. So if you can see the transmission tower, you can hear it. It really is that simple. So the higher you go, the further the thing travels, because once it goes off the end of the horizon, then it goes off into space. And you can actually achieve an awful lot with very little power consumption until you hit a hill, and it won't go through the hill. It will just bounce off it. So the big problem we had was the Relindia building was 18 stories, but didn't see over the top of the hill in the city. So they quickly worked out that what we'd have to do is put one FM transmitter on top of one building to reach another one, which was at a place called Sunny Hill, and was the highest point in Pristina. And we would have to buy the apartments at the top, turn it into a transmission station, and stick the main mast on there, from where we could cover 85% of the landmass, using just 10 kilowatts, using a very small power level. And the transmission mast was made very rapidly in Skopje in Macedonia by a company there, who made the thing in a couple of days, with the antenna on it and everything. And as NATO went in to take control of Pristina, we followed behind them, and this thing was flown up from Macedonia underneath a Chinook helicopter, and dropped onto the roof. I mean, just, where do you want it, mate? Drop it there. Dropped onto the roof with some people ready to put the concrete, put the guidelines on, put the concrete surrounds on, to make sure it doesn't fall over. And suddenly you had a viable system that could operate and broadcast to around 85%. There are some bits that in river valleys that you would not cover, but you would cover the whole country. And in fact, that system was in use for more than 3 years, until the transmission stations were replaced. And this thing actually happened. We went in and occupied part of the Relindia building. We built a temporary studio inside what was the stationery store. Where you store if you think about, when you open the door, where you store the reams of A4, that was the only solid part we could use. So we had to build it it was right in the corner of the office. It was quite bizarre. So whereas you usually go into a broadcast place and everything is grand sweeping desks everywhere, this place, that's nothing. I mean, we just had the desks. And there was nothing to work from. So we're using a temporary solution, which was used by the radio station for more than a year. It was, it was the studio in the broom cupboard, literally. There was nothing else available. And so off they go. And they turned out to, we sent a very small team to work with them. We did not influence them, apart from developing editorial guidelines, providing literally on-the-job training. It's some of the people were quite experienced. Some of them, they'd been trained by this group. This is the first real go they'd had of being, on-air reporters and presenters and everything else. So we had to do a lot of work, particularly on the younger end of the staff. And it's also the older end as well, because they'd worked in a completely different environment. And we were holding hands with them for about a year. And it was a very, you can imagine this taking people who have got little experience and suddenly reporting with them in a very, very sensitive post-conflict zone. Bearing in mind that most of these people came from one side of that conflict. So inside Kosovo, you had a particular dynamic. So it's not all Albanian. And one of the reasons for the issues which occurred there for many years afterwards was that it's also home to some of the most important sites in the Serb Orthodox Church. And although the cities were predominantly Albanian, there were issues because there were lots of clusters of villages that were people who were of Serbian ethnicity, usually elderly people. And at the time, the ethnic cleansing was working in reverse. So gangs of Albanians had gone and burned down their homes, attacked their churches and other things. And it was a very, you had to work in all of the sensitivities that are required in live reporting a story like that, to make sure that you are not part of the problem. You're supposed to cause the problems. And it's very easy in that environment to have someone go and do that, because it's just one word gone wrong, or one phrase wrong, and you start a riot, and you can start all sorts of trouble. So often live, all the time. And to make it more interesting, you've also got the involvement of Russia, they were already present in the Balkans in the various UN peacekeeping forces. And this was during the time of Boris Yeltsin. They were not happy with the idea of NATO invading into their turf. They consider Serbia very much in their orbit for all sorts of reasons: religion, language, culture, everything else. And they decided at the last minute to take possession of Pristina Airport. So you had, on the one hand, you had NATO and the OSCE running one load of things, and it was a battalion of Russian soldiers doing their own thing at the airport. And this is one of the times, okay, no one's saying, did we start World War III? But there was a potential conflict zone, because, as you can imagine, the airport means that you control the most efficient form of transport. And nothing could come in and out of that airport without the Russians say so. So you've got an interethnic conflict going on one hand, you've got an international one going on just up the road at the airport, and the Russians really were not playing the game at all. They were literally doing their own thing. They were not taking orders from anybody. They were outside of the peacekeeping structure, and all the time you had to refer to them. So if you wanted to organize a flight in, you had to talk to the Russians. If you wanted to pass on the road outside the airport, you had to go and talk to the Russians. And if they didn't want you to, there's nothing you could do about it. So it was at the time, a very free-bar environment. And also at the same time, you're looking at where traditional infrastructure, where your traditional mechanisms of running a civil society were non-existent. So it had all been the police had left. They disappeared. They're all Serbs. They'd all gone. The police stations have been destroyed. They've been in precision attacks. They're all gone. So the police, the police force had to be brought in from outside temporarily, and you had to do a complete civil society inside a post-conflict zone, and that is actually the difficult bit. And we've all seen that go wrong all around the world. Just give me the name of the conflict, and you'll see it. I mean, this is one of the events to come a few years later, because what we found was unless you allow for this, it can go wrong very, very quickly for you as the occupier. And in this instance, the Albanians wanted KFOR, as it was in, which was the NATO force there, but there was nobody to protect apart from KFOR. No one to protect the Serbs. No one to protect the buildings, and all of the civilian infrastructure was being run by various militaries, who that's not their job. And if I saw this, you give them a job, okay, go and take possession of that. So if I saw them coming up the road, I would get out the way. I mean, there's no doubt. You said, whoops, what the hell's this? Or the tank's coming at you. I would get out the way without doubt at all. However, they turn up and say, right, there you go, chaps, over to you. And we've done our bit. We've achieved our military objective. Over to you lot. There's no plan at all. And so at the same time, you were having to provide information. So this got to a point where it was dealing with regular power cuts, which I'm sure is something you're all familiar with. And I'm sure you're familiar with the situation where when you get power cuts, eventually other things start to break down around it. So, for example, where the water supply is dependent on electricity to drive the pumps. So as the power runs out, the water system breaks down. Other things which we were having to work to report on. One of the tactics of the Yugoslav army, the Serb army, was to leave booby traps all over the place. So they had a very abhorrent methodology of not leaving a minefield, leaving just one mine in a field. This is very, usually, as I've learned recently at the back of a conflict, where are the mines? And the other military can tell you where they are, and you can then go and get rid of them. You can then use people to get rid of them. What didn't help was they would just put one mine cynically at a place, for example, close to a children's playground, where months later, some poor kid's going to come across it and get blown to pieces. Dealing with all of that, and making sure people were aware of that. One of the best way of telling the stories is through anecdotes. One of the most frightening things that happened to us was some kid came up the stairs one day with a bag, and we are on the 15th floor, and there's no operative lift at all. The lift broke down and hadn't been repaired, and this kid turns up into what was in effect our radio station reception, empties the contents of the bag on the receptionist table and says, "I was told to hand these in," because they'd heard the advert on our radio station. "I was told to hand these in." They were cluster bombs, unexploded cluster bombs, about 15 of them in his bag. I mean, I've never seen so many people run out the door as fast as that. But that's the kind of thing, you're having to raise, cluster bombs, they were all over the place. They were used. They were all over the place. And it's a case of, okay, you're having to raise awareness of the issues. But when we said hand them in, please don't bring them to us, because we can't, we can't dispose of them. So we had to carry on broadcasting, like with a whole batch of unexploded ordnance sat on a table just outside, waiting for NATO to come and take them away. And as they wouldn't come in. They had to use a robot arm to get them. As they picked one up, one exploded in the building. That's how dangerous they were. If you'd have dropped one, they would have gone off. And there are so many. It's bringing all that together and running a successful reporting operation, a radio station, which gathered. There was a lot of method in the madness when we said, no, get one, make it strong, build it up, get the best talent. and it worked incredibly well to the point where they rolled on 2 years later to launch I'd left by then, to launch a full-blown television station. And what's very important, the moral of the story there was they survived. So it's one of the few cases of a media development intervention where you actually left something behind. The company still exists today. It's still run by the same people, the same two. It was a husband and wife team who manage it. It now runs 6 TV stations, 2 radio stations, and it's either number 1 or number 2 in the market in Kosovo. It flicks between them and another commercial station, but they're the substantial players in the market, and that's where within media development, what I find is quite important is to actually look for things which will work, not things which will fail. And that is very, very, very difficult to do, because when anything's being driven by a government or an agency which is related to a government or any government funding, it always comes with baggage. So in this case, the idea is quite simple. It's to go in, create a radio station. It was to deal with a crisis. If it happens to survive beyond that, that's fine. But let's get something talking to an audience in Albanian, giving news in Albanian that isn't biased, that's fairly reporting the conflict, and so on. Do that. If you do that, we'll be happy. That's fairly straightforward. At the moment now, you'll hear lots of different propositions come forward. The most worrying one is anything which mentions the word disinformation. And at this point, you want to run to the door, because it's okay. What is disinformation? Where does it come from? Now, it's people using terminology where they don't really understand what they mean. So when you say disinformation, it comes in different formats. And there is genuine disinformation is where somebody has a nefarious purpose for circulating what it is that they're doing. So they're being paid by somebody, they're political activists of a certain extremity. They have got a motivation to mislead you, often on behalf of their employer. Surprisingly, there isn't actually that much of that. There is a bit, and most of what exists has already been highlighted. It's generally state actors and non-state actors doing it, but it gets confused with the other part, which is people who have differences of opinion. So, okay, on the one hand, there is actually driven disinformation. On the other hand, you have different opinions which are being shot down as being disinformation. Let me give you an example of that, and it's a controversial one. During the various COVID issues, every government had a view on what it wanted its population to do. Alongside that, there were lots of people saying, no, don't do that. That's not right. And they weren't just, your average Joe doing it. There were people, academics, surgeons, epidemiologists. If any of these ever reared their head on a radio station, on a social media platform, on YouTube or anything, they would just be closed down. And so the first bit is, okay, what actually is disinformation and what isn't? So the other bit is, okay, how do we deal with the disinformation part? Well, it's really easy. Just close it down. No, it doesn't work like that. If I skip to a current project which we're working on at the moment, which is slightly different but very similar. So in other words, there's a huge problem in some parts of the world with material emanating from Russia. notably to do with Ukraine, but there are lots of other things going on as well. There's Moldova and Georgia in particular are areas of concern. So much of the information space, particularly in that part of Eastern Europe, is controlled or linked in one way or another to Russia, either through ownership, through affiliation. So someone said, okay, how can we? Moldova is very much it's a small country, 3 million people. Is very much seen to be at risk of Russian influence, trying to, for nefarious purposes, destabilize the government for whatever reason it's trying. Nobody really knows what they're trying to do, but there's a lot of effort going on there. So how do you stop people watching or take their eyes away from Russian contents, which includes propaganda? And there are several ways you can do that. The first instinct that any government has is to shut it down, is to say, okay, we will close you down, we will ban you, you can go. So the first thing, that the minute you ban something is the minute people want more of it. So you're also highlighting where to go and find your Kremlin propaganda. And in this case, it's in your face. It is emanating from several television stations who are misreporting. Their reporting is slanted. Their reporting will always respect the Kremlin's view. But it also turns up in programs, in dramas, in all sorts of things. And it's all over the place. So we came up with or not us, but several people got drafted in to look at this. And the best way to do it was to fight fire with fire. So if the nefarious content is emanating from, excuse me a second, I was recovering from a cold. If the nefarious content is emanating and is being watched, produce content on the other side, which is just as good and which people want to watch. So it's okay, that's fine. And that's how you do it. So it's not a case of close it down, get rid of it. So what it was a case of doing was working with existing broadcasters to increase, basically to take the viewers off Russian TV stations and onto theirs. Because the Russians could outspend them, and they produce amazing drama. There's a high level of Russian speaking in Moldova, and it's all subtitled. So we can't suddenly spend $1 million an hour on dramas that are, that can compete with them. That isn't going to work. But we can spend a bit and really produce some really, really good stuff that will pull viewers off that channel and put them onto ours. And it's a slow process. And we started doing this through basically working with producers, sifting through ideas. They had to be cost effective. So we're talking maximum 20,000 US an episode, if that, to be able to develop them. And we developed a couple of really simple dramas that were reasonably effective. But the breakthrough one was a really simple, and it's an old favorite, which is a cop show, which is to go out and follow the emergence. It's a blue light show. It's the genealogy of them was cops in the US, was where you just get access, you negotiate access to the emergency services, and you go follow them, and you follow them for a few months, and you see all of human stories at their best or worst or whatever. And this had never been done before. Nobody had ever seen the emergency services up close before in Moldova. So it was genuinely a first. And it did, it freaked them out. I mean, to be all, we worked with a local production company. We were working with the cops, the ambulance, and the fire services, and it was just freaking them out because, like, the idea of having cameras follow you around, watching what you're doing, and bear in mind that these are not exactly known for their probity. A lot of corruption, all sorts. I mean, they did behave themselves most of the time. Nobody took a bribe in front of us or in front of the camera crews. This thing cut into a series of 7 programs, which we then put together, and we started to build the schedule on Moldova 1, which is the public service broadcaster there. And we devised a schedule with this, a game show, and the principal news program at 10 p.m. And within 3 weeks, it had become the market leader in the slot. So a lot of it was, making this show good, making it controversial, people seeing things they'd never seen before. It's basically every trick that you would use to develop a popular television show documentary, including publicizing it, targeting it properly, and we also, we accidentally, and this was not in any way deliberate, there was a mistake made in post-production involving blurring faces. So generally there are some rules on how you identify people and people you should not identify, which led to an incorrect version being shown with all the faces clear. Now the guy was drunk and was calling out ambulances. So he was sat in a park in Chisinau, downing vodka, making emergency calls and wasting ambulance time. And eventually the police came along to sort him out, and that was when he got filmed. But whereas when we're working in a Western environment, the guidelines are really easy because they've been done before. When you're working in this kind of environment, you have to invent them as you go along. And we thought, okay, for safety, blob his face out. But what happened was, the one that got played out was about 3 versions earlier with no blurring, and we suddenly a load of money appeared, and this guy tried suing and using part of the Human Rights Convention, so claiming that we had breached his human rights. I mean, it's antisocial behaviour, even though I was mortified at the mistake, it is exposing antisocial behaviour. What goes around comes around. Anyway, the first instinct of the donor in this case was the US State Department. The broadcaster and one of the implementing partners were headbutting the table, absolutely screaming their heads off, like, oh my God, what have we done? And we're going, opportunity. So this is the journalist in us, said, okay, this is going to be controversial. Great. So that, we reckon, added 2 percentage points onto that week's viewing figures, because people wanted to watch it was all over the local papers, it was all over the radio, it was publicity that we could not buy. I was accused several times of having done this deliberately, and it was a cock-up, it was a mistake. But we made sure we exploited that mistake to do it. So that's basically, that also in itself controversial is satires. We've done 3 satire series. Now this is again something people find quite strange. So we've done satires in Nigeria, Kenya, and the Kyrgyz Republic. And they all came from a similar thing. So one of the companies I work for, we have quite close connections to The Daily Show. And we work with some of their writers and directors. So the first one, the major one that we did, was with a company called Channels Television in Nigeria, where they wanted the show. They wanted to, in the words of the CEO, to stir things up a little bit. Now, this is where it gets really interesting or really curious, because when you start looking at news consumption around the world, there are some very strange trends, not strange, but very important trends going on or kicking around. The first one is how younger people consume news. And as we're finding in the UK and other places, that they do not consume it from television news bulletins. So if I take the UK as an example, the average age of a viewer on the BBC's main news programmes is 61 years old and getting older. So where do people get their news from? Well, I mean, the sources are coming up as TikTok, YouTube, other social networks and other things. So this is an old style commercial TV news operation saying we need to change the way we do things. And the one way, so the one method that we thought of doing it was using satire. Okay. And some of the money for this actually came from the British government, but under the premise that if anything ever goes wrong, it was nothing to do with them. And so the initial funding was channeled to another vehicle where it couldn't be identified because they were worried. They were very, very worried. And what this involved doing was getting a comedian and a team of writers to produce news in a satirical way, in a format which will be watched by a younger urban audience, which also includes all of the jokes, all of the things that go with it, but also combined, as I'm sure if you're familiar with The Daily Show, as combined with hard-hitting interviews and other things. I'm going to run you a clip of it. It's about 3 minutes. It's just a small show reel, but this will give you an idea of what got created. Just share my screen share sound, optimize for that. Should now, hang on a second, be able to see this.
Yeah, my name is Okay. This is the show that you've been waiting for. America want to fight North Korea because their leaders want to find out who has the biggest button in the land. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, the only thing that can cause fights with other countries is jollof rice. Election day was an opportunity for the youth to come out en masse and vote for councillors and chairmen that will represent them. So thousands of youths woke up that early morning in spite of the rain and did what young people do best. Tweet from their beds. Nigeria's blood pressure goes up when oil prices drop and drop when oil prices go up. No wonder the first company to find oil in Nigeria was called BP. Former Vice President Atiku Abubakar has said that for Nigeria to make progress, the economy needs to grow faster than the population. Wow. That's a good advice from a man who has almost 30 children.
I am saying to the existing political class, game over. Get off the pitch.
Wow.
I'm asking young people, organize yourself. They have all the tools that they need. They have the social media. And it's not just about getting there and posting nude pictures and talking trash.
Yeah.
And assaulting us with their terrible grammar. Okay? Yes. It's about, mobilizing and organizing themselves.
There are some Nigerians who are giving us problem even in diaspora. People like this.
I come through like bang da da dam, everything like da da dam, smash through like bang da da dam, da da dam.
How these people usually escape deportation radar is what I still do not understand.
If it's to work for the people, then you will not care whether women are there or not. But it's because in Nigeria, government office is to steal.
There's just that one word for it, corruption.
Corruption. You begin to look at how to create wealth. And part of the thing we lack in leadership in this country is creative minds. We don't have creative minds in leadership position.
Just producing pencils in Nigeria, we can create as many as 400,000 jobs.
What would we be making next? Sharpeners, erasers, or supersonic jets?
We are going to start production of biros.
And I must use the opportunity to thank the management of Channels Television and your very good self for this Pantagruelian and revelation intervention into our body policy.
I have to prepare at this point.
Yes.
I have to prepare for the bullets that you'll be dropping.
I have no doubt at all that the master satirist, Professor Olantoji Dare, will be very proud of what you are doing.
Yeah. You guys, Jon Stewart, people like that, are kind of figuring it out for the audience, more so than the journalists or the media do. So you play a very important role.
The truth right here, ladies and gentlemen, is that we're a good people and a great nation. And all it takes is to activate the Nigerian spirit for us to be positive in our thoughts, insert a lot of hard work, and our dreams will surely come through like bang da da da. I'll see you next week. But in the meantime, if you see me walking down the road, don't be shy. Holla at your boy. My name is Okay. Bye-bye. Yeah.
So hopefully that gave you a rough, very small flavour of what that one was about. But it's a classic studio-based satire, and you know, in terms of the truth to power thing. Oh my God, did that do it? You know, it did not pull its punches. It would lay into anything. I mean, even we got nervous when they started with religion. Because you know Nigeria is you know, it's not divided, but it's a, you know, it's a Christian Muslim mix, huge Christian Muslim mix, and into politics and into business, and I was in the country when the first episode was broadcast. I seriously thought we were going to be arrested and deported, but we weren't, and a lot of it helped because it was on a mainstream channel. That really helped, but the secret to making it work is something that we've pursued through our careers, which is, firstly, is there a demand for this product? Yes or no? The only way you can do it is to research it. Is there a demand for this? Is there a need? Does anybody actually want to watch this product? That's the other one. And to do that, the only way to find out is to use broadcast methodology. And use research companies who actually know how to make that work. Because if you start you know, we were able to identify the target audience very, very quickly, and make several. And once you then feed that into the program that you're making or the show that you're making, you then follow it through in the entire run. And start to make changes where you see faults, or where the audience will alert you to faults, because you're watching your retention graphs and you're watching them against the timeline of the show. So when you see the retention dipping, we start to look into why and start to engineer that out. So in this case, the other news, I mean, the whole story, we could write a book on it. Because in that TV station in particular, and Nigerian television generally, they'd never produced anything like that before. And it was very difficult because comedy and satire is about timing. So, for example, on a vision mixer, you've got to get the timing right in the cuts. So after several dummy runs, we had to come to the conclusion that the only way we could make this show was by doing what I'm sure you may be familiar with this phrase, a multi-cam edit. So in other words, we were using what was mixed in the studio as a reference, and then feeding in what's called the ISOs, the isolated recordings off the 5 studio cameras, and recreating it in post-production. Because the speed which you had to bring up your graphics, your film clips, all the camera moves, the equipment couldn't cope with it. And it wasn't just the people couldn't cope. It was not designed to do that. So we had to use lots of different workarounds, which made the post-production schedule. It was recorded on Wednesday, broadcast Thursday, a whole overnight business. Because getting the timing and getting the cutting in, everything else. But what that did was it took the news and information to an audience that was consuming none at an election time. And the audience was female biased. It was urban middle class bias as well, which for an advertising perspective is exactly what the TV station needs. So the idea behind it was to go from nothing to show to audience to us exiting as fast as possible. And so by the time you run into week number 3 or 4, you're starting to generate audience data, which you can then take out to potential sponsors and say, here's what we have. In this case, we've got like 3 million people watching this. They're all mostly female, mostly in the 1825 range, mostly educated. And up comes Nokia, took on the production budget. So that's basically the start. Is there a demand for this? If you get that bit right and you move it right the way through, does the product actually land? And if it doesn't land, why doesn't it land? And then move on to the final part, which is, look, this is the audience we can deliver to you now on a plane. Of course, at the same time, the whole thing lent into social media heavily. This was pre-TikTok days. This is just before TikTok became a thing. But it ran for 7 seasons on its own. What was really bizarre was that the donor, which was the British government, I don't want to mention that, came back and said, about halfway through the run, do you want some more cash to do your second season? I said, no, we don't. And they couldn't believe us. So we don't want you to, because if you do that, you will bring about donor dependency. But what we're looking at now, and I'll conclude on this, is that when we look at the industry globally as it is now, like the other news, the program you just seen, was what I call a vertical. So it's designed to be a big success on big old-fashioned television. It's also designed so it can work specifically on certain social media platforms. In this case, at the time, it was YouTube and Facebook. However, now you would start to lean, with that audience profile, you would start to lean much more towards TikTok now, certainly in Nigeria. But we'd work that bit out. We'd actually work out where to land it. So you've got one product running and now distributing on multiple arms. And the thing is that this is very, very important, is that it's a product in its own right. Now we're coming into a point, I don't know if everyone's discussed this with you yet, of what's called the end of the traffic age. So what does that mean? It's a pile of nonsense. It actually means that we as media operators are being cut off by the tech platforms. I'm sure some of you have come across this in the last few years. So before, we were the tech platforms' friends. So we relied heavily on Google, on Facebook, on X and Twitter and the others to feed traffic to us, which they would gladly do. And then a few years ago, they started to change. So why do we need all of these news people? We want, we were going counter to each other's business objectives. So the problem we're facing, or the problem that the issue that we're dealing with, is that they are no longer referring the traffic. In fact, if you do a search on a traditional search engine now, it won't take you off to the news providers immediately. And we are being cut off by them. It's simple. They want to keep you on their platform for as long as they possibly can. This has really screwed up the business models of a lot of newspapers, magazine publishers, broadcasters, all sorts. And we're having to think again. And a lot of people seem to think this is a terminal event, and it's not. Because what matters most is, firstly, is having good content. So the good content can be a TV program. It can just be a program. It can be a YouTube property. It can be a podcast. It can be one of many things. And it's what you now do with it is matters. Now, we were looking at different things. So the newspaper industry, which is widely thought to have been on its knees, is actually now recovering quite quickly through using subscription models, of which there are various, ranging from Patreon right the way through to tiered subscriptions. Because one of the things that we as creators have been really bad at doing is realizing that what we create is very, very valuable, and we should not be frightened to sell it where necessary to fund it. And that's the bit we've always been frightened of. I was at an event just recently in London where we were going through all of this, and we came to 2 major conclusions. The first one was that we have been too frightened to go on our own. And now the newspaper industry in particular has led the way. It started many years ago with the Financial Times, but you'll see it spread across the New Yorker, the New York Times, Washington Post, spreading around the world very, very quickly, is paywalls. We made the mistake of letting our stuff go for free, and that's got to stop. The idea is you either have an absolute paywall where you've got to pay to get in, or a tiered paywall where you can read so much and then pay for so much. But the idea is not to be frightened for what we charge for content. The second point is, especially if you have career changes and movers here, is thinking, well, artificial intelligence is going to remove us, the humans, from the news process. And I've never heard so much nonsense in my life as I have in the last 2 years. The amount of nonsense and hype and rubbish that has been spread about the capabilities of AI. Okay, it's artificial, it's not necessarily intelligence. And it's not sentient. People don't realize this stuff is using statistical models. We now actually have seen a way, and to us is nothing new. So, okay, if I look at my output now, I mostly work in podcast areas, YouTube, and all sorts of other things. I am using AI tools to remove a lot of what I would call the grunt work. So, for example, I was recording for a project I'm working on a lot of interviews for a podcast this afternoon. I've used AI to generate the first level transcripts, which it's done quite well. I'm using Riverside FM to generate the first level transcripts. Before, it would take ages, and now it's pretty smooth. It works quite well. It's okay. It's not okay to publish them. We need to post edit them, but that was a job that would take hours. It's now been removed. In the video production space, we use a lot of AI modeling now, for example, to correct audio and to perform color correction to a point. So in other words, it takes away the basic and very dull part of the job. And which would take, some of this stuff, we can feed it into an AI model and it will remove and clean up in 10, 15 minutes, something that would take me all day to do. That's a smart use of AI. Others are using it to, for example, to create headlines. So some magazines are using it. They feed in the articles, it creates headlines. Others are using it to generate headlines. What we're not doing is using it to replace the reporters. How on earth can an AI tool come up with an exclusive and go out and you still need the humans. So if you view it in a way that this stuff, okay, you hear all the hype about ChatGPT, Perplexity, all the others, if you just throw it away, and it's just, it's like, the automobile won't catch on. We need to stay on these old horses things, Yes, you have to adapt it and you have to adopt the role. You have to adapt around it. But what we came to the conclusion was, well, if we're using it smart, then we can do it with less people. But actually it means that the people that we have, we can use them more meaningfully by going out and actually doing the work they need to do rather than spending an hour and a half color correcting it. So that's where we are with the AI side, is that what we're finding is, there's a lot of fatalism kicking about this business at the moment. So, it's on the decline. It's not. There's been elements of corporate stupidity which have led to its temporary decline. But if you look at the main publishers, the main titles, and the main media houses, they are now more powerful, more profitable, and will continue to do so. Any questions on that? I've gone through quite a lot there. We're probably struggling to catch up. Anyway, I saw some questions come in, but I couldn't flick between the screens. So, questions, please.
So, thank you so much, first of all. I think we can listen to you for 1 more hour straight.
I don't think I can talk for 1 more hour, but yeah, struggle.
But again, we have some questions, so let's get to the those ones. So someone is asking, how can we report war crimes now in more effective way to reach the right audience?
How can we report more crimes?
More war crimes now in most effective ways to reach the right people.
Okay, well, the first thing is, what is a war crime? The reporting of war crimes is a very complicated matter. So a lot of the treaties are actually not legally binding, and they're not legally binding on one of the biggest players. The US is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. So the way to report war crimes is it does require much more eyewitness reporting of incidents, which involves much more risk taking. It also involves one of the problems with war crimes reporting is always remember, in conflicts, the first victim is truth. Now, this comes, for example, at the moment with the situation, if I pick that, I didn't really do this, but pick off Gaza, for example, is both sides have a bit of a strange relationship with the truth. So, for example, eyewitness reporting where you see physically what happens is the best way to report it. The rest of it becomes incredibly complicated. I mean, for example, issuing an arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu is a complete waste of time because nobody's going to enforce it. But people seeing what happens on the ground, and particularly seeing what happens to individual people, is the best way to report war crimes. Then, however, you still have to be very careful. So, you know, with injury figures, with building purposes and other things, but that's the best way. War crimes, I mean, there are the high-profile ones, but they're not necessarily the ones that we should be reporting. Does that answer the question? It's a bit convoluted, but yeah, complicated.
Yeah. Okay, so moving towards the next question. So next question is, how can we overcome the mental challenges if we are reporting from an area of conflict? With your experience, please guide the important areas which we must not overlook, especially related to safety.
Okay, safety is something which is incredibly important. So before any of us got deployed into, I mean, I did the Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Iraq, Yemen, a few others, we were all trained. So we got sent off on what's called hostile environment courses. And now I understand there are several organizations making these available online. But they can only train you. So much. There's a lot of practical work involved, and the information becomes out of date very, very quickly. So there are some online providers now, various journalism institutes that do basic online things. The most important one, and the one that we have had to use the most, is first aid. It's okay. There's a bit about not getting in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's the hard part. Increasingly now, from the Western organizations, they now send people with you. So if you're going, for an example, the last time I worked in Yemen, each person had to have 2 people with them, partly because of the kidnap risk being so high. And also partly because of you needed somebody with local knowledge to intercept trouble. So the safety side, yeah, I mean, it is a case of no matter how much you train, the information becomes out of date very quickly because of the tactics which are used. When I first started traveling to difficult environments, on kidnapping, the advice used to be get kidnapped. In other words, if somebody came in, pointed a gun at you and tried to kidnap you, then was to go along with it. Now that has completely changed. Now, if you did the same thing again, they would tell you to fight and scream like crazy to not get kidnapped in the first place. Because the tactics used have changed. And this is where you have to be very careful. So realistically, you're on your own. You know, but it is very important to keep up to date and keep up to date with the techniques which are being used. Interestingly, one of the ones that we were first taught was if you lose your mobile phone and it suddenly comes back, don't touch it. What's happened just recently? This was after the Chechens. One of the warlords lost his mobile temporarily. He came back to him and blew him up. And we're just seeing the end of that happen now with Hezbollah, with electrical. You know, it comes along and it changes. But when we, you know, the best safety arbiter is you. But the one thing that if you can't get access to the specialist military stuff, get access to first aid training. That is so, I mean, it is so important. Bizarrely, the one place I had to use it was in London. Yeah, that was of all the things I've done. You know, we've had to actually think, hang on a minute, you know, what do I do now? And if you can stop somebody bleeding to death, that, you know, until they can get to medical help, that is the most important thing.
So our next question is, how can we check affiliations of different organizations, especially when we are working contents, what might not reach or get eliminated?
Okay, in other words, the credibility of people, only you know that. So generally you have to go on to local knowledge as to who actually speaks with authority and who doesn't. There are self-appointed authorities. You have to basically see through it. In our case, often when you're away somewhere, we dependent on the fixers. So you are dependent on the person. If you don't know the context inside out, you really heavily depend on your fixer to work out who actually you should be talking to. I mean, this is very cynical, is that I operate on a believe nothing basis. Is treat everything that everybody says with the same level of skepticism. Because there are even numbers, there are lies, damn lies, statistics. So again, if you go to Gaza, again, you know, both sides have got great play in using numbers. So these number of civilians died. Were they civilians? Yeah. Who's a non-combatant here? Who do you define as a non-combatant? So basically, once we do get into who does what, is make sure that numbers and facts, or numbers or things that are portrayed as facts, are correctly attributed to the source. That way, it's not a case of "but you said," and this has become a big issue just recently. But you said, no, they said that. We reported what they said. We also reported what they said. And this is actually it's the BBC's method, which has come under attack recently. And you know you're getting it right is if you're coming under attack from everyone. So, you know, my former colleagues at the BBC have got both the Israeli government, Hamas and everybody else saying, no, that's wrong. Once that happens, you know you've got it right, because they don't want you to report what the other lot's saying. So it's basically make sure that, okay, it can't just be a person on the street said 100 people died. It needs to be a doctor. It needs to be a medical authority. It needs to be somebody. But as long as it's attributed to that source, then it's fine. We had a really embarrassing story once in London with a fire. Any of you know London King's Cross Underground Station, which is the busiest on the network, went up in smoke one night, killed 60 people. Except at one point, the death toll hit 120. And then 66 people miraculously came back to life. It was simply a mistake by the London Ambulance Service double counting the dead. And so it was embarrassing. And the next morning, actually, you know, we said 120 people. Actually, we were wrong. It was 60. But they said it, not us. And it only came out in the inquiry. They were double counting. Why they double counted, I don't know how the hell they did that. But, you know what I mean? It's like numbers, facts, statistics. I always assume they're wrong, but always attribute them, and then you're fine.
Question derives exactly from this, that how can we identify authenticity of news when there is so much made up stories there?
So the first part, how can we identify
How can we identify authenticity of news when we have so much made up news stories?
Well, the thing is there that much made up news? Now, this is, yeah, there is some. I mean, and this comes into under the umbrella of media literacy. The basic one is, if something is too good to be true, it probably is. And that's how you identify them. I mean, yeah, there is a lot of issues with deep fakes, deep fake video, and other things. Do you know what? Every time you see one, I mean, every time I see one, I can tell. You know, it's just not right. I mean, you know, for example, the Pope, I mean, this is going back to the last American election, the Pope endorsing Donald Trump. I mean, if you believe that, then I believe we have an issue with the gene pool. You know, I mean, it's actually meant to be funny. It's not meant to be serious. But okay, there is deep fake and then deep fake. But usually you can spot them. I mean, you can see when video has been manipulated. You know, the Pope is not going to endorse Donald Trump. I mean, if he did, that would be very interesting. You know, he's not going to endorse Kamala Harris. He's not going to say, you know, he might make a comment on the conflict in the Middle East, but he won't back one side over the other. So it's applying common sense to what you're seeing. And this has gone out of the window in the last few years, is that the biggest danger is sharing. So it's like kids sharing the deep fakes and them getting passed off as news. There's not a lot we can do about that. I mean, I go back to Nigeria, where we worked on a campaign with one of the Democratic Institutes on the life almost imitated art, because the story that was being used in the adverts was that the leading party was cloning voters, and this guy gets up and starts sharing it wildly amongst his cohort, and you know, it's that sort of thing that, like, you see it and you start sharing it, and it then adds credibility to it. Then somebody high profile gets hold of it and shares it. Bizarrely, with this one, later, one of the main political parties was proven to have been manipulating the voting register, which was in effect the same thing. And so we actually had accidentally exposed the fraud before it even happened. It was quite strange. But no, it's a case of we can't stop it, and trying to stop it won't work. It's a case of, you know, is this actually believable? The other side to it as well is, particularly if you're in a news organization, is that the phrase "the camera never lies" is now gone, because it does lie. And one of the biggest, deepest manipulations you get are video clips coming into you, being sent in by the public. Now we have to watch them carefully, and you have to verify them. And if necessary, they can go to places where they can really verify them. So it's a case of, you said this, you know, I mean, some of it is quite obvious, like the time of day and the lighting doesn't correspond. I was just recently involved in a case where we had to remove they were from Gaza, they were fake photographs, and they were just so clearly fake that it was you know, it's things like people placing teddy bears on things, like, no, yeah, that's not real. That doesn't work. But you start to use common sense and look for, okay, this was supposed to happen at this time. Where's the sun? Get on Google Maps, look at the orientation of the shots. Where is the sun? And you'll suddenly see, hang on a minute, this was hours later. This was before this happened. This wasn't at that location. If it's needed, then you can actually, there are places that can verify, that have got whole teams that work for days on analysing through the clips. Most 80% of them we can do ourselves, and you can normally spot the genuine ones. I've had the odd one go through, it goes wrong, but usually it's a case of applying common sense to them.
So next question is from Mubina. She's asking, I would like to know, what are the potential risks or backlash from using the Satire in reporting? Satire.
Using the what? Sorry, satire in reporting. Well, there are loads of risks, but without risks, you don't get rewards. So if you take some of the satire is, I mean, it's news in another way. So as long as you don't provoke incredible offence at one group or another, then generally you're fine. Because part of the thing about satire is taking a step back and looking at the ridiculousness or otherwise of what is going on. Now, obviously, there are some things where you might have trouble with that. But however, if you look at the antics of governments and the things they say and do, they're absolutely outrageous sometimes. I mean, we've just got one. I don't expect you to follow British news at the moment, but we've got a prime minister who, it turns out, his wardrobe is completely supplied by a donor, right? By a really powerful businessman, and he's been clothing. Now, the prime minister's paid $200,000 a year. He doesn't seem to understand why people are pissed off with him, because I can't go out in the street and say, hey, do you mind buying me a $10,000 suit? And that's when satire comes in, because you can't laugh at yourself. They don't realize, and that's the truth, the power thing, is the insult and the fury that this has caused. And so now, if you go through our social media here, it's full of clips and skits about donations to charity. And at the same time, so this is how it all combines together, the government has just removed a winter fuel payment that's made to pensioners. We get cold here, and it's meant to go to the over 66s to help pay their fuel bills. So, you look at it and go, you don't even have to write a script. Just those facts presented in that order. And it's like, it's A, funny, it's B, stupid, C, it's the government. So where you do have to be careful is where you have very deep religious sensitivities. We can get away with it here, and we don't really mind. Because even, some of it is just, you have to laugh at yourselves. So realistically, it's a case of just watching out, being careful, knowing when you're going too far. But believe me, there is enough satire material to keep the world going for the next 100 years.
So next we have a raised hand, Wahid. So you can go ahead and ask your questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Divya. Thank you so much, sir, for providing such kind of information. We have learned a lot of things. The question arises, what are the potential benefits and drawbacks of using AI? As you know, sir, that we're in the era of using the AIs, artificial intelligence, to create a satirical content for social commentary.
Okay, that's quite simple. As long as you flag it up, as long as you don't try and pass it off as real, that's fine. It's if you try to pass it off as real, that's a deep fake. So, and we've kind of evolving around guidelines. This is evolving now, and even the social channels have this. Is that you need to flag up that this character has been created artificially, and as simple as that. And then you know what you're watching. So, in other words, it's being transparent with it. Yeah, you have a lot of fun with AI, with creating characters on screen and having characters do things and reanimating their lips. As long as it's identified as this and you're not trying to pass it off as real, then it's okay. The trouble will start if you try and pass it off as real. That's when the issue will come. Even at the moment, where we have a couple of radio stations which their sports bulletins are read by AI. And it's done quite well, and it's actually, I don't have a problem with it, but they flag it up first when they do tell you that this is an AI-generated sports bulletin, so you know it's not a real person talking to you. It also helps when it gets it wrong, because it mispronounces the East European tennis players' names incorrectly, so it kind of is a get out. But yeah, generally is don't pass it off as real. Make sure people know, flag it up, and that's fine. Anybody else?
Yes, we have some more questions. There's a
Okay.
question from Jannat. She's asking, having worked globally, how do you navigate media bias and ensure fair reporting across different culture and political landscapes?
Okay, well, that's because it can be quite entertaining turning on the television in your hotel room and watching some channels that are not particularly impartial, especially when they're government owned. So how do we? I mean, most places, if you think about how we can operate, then most places don't have a problem with you, particularly people who've come in from overseas, questioning them. However, I mean, I've had all sorts of issues with being informed that Minister X or Y was most displeased about being asked this question. If you want to come here again, then you'd better not do that again. And we just ignore it. It may sound very arrogant to do that, but the most important, is how do you control? It's all about the control thing. And being in government, particularly in anything which is pretending to be or purports to be a democracy, it needs accountability. And there is still to me, a government-owned TV station is an oxymoron. The thing shouldn't exist. How can it be impartial if it's owned by the government? So the thing is, I know that. So we know, and this is the other stupid part, is that one of the reasons this needs a lot of thinking about and reform is because we know which station, we know who owns, most of you will know who owns the broadcaster you're watching. And therefore, you'll know damn well that what they're telling you is a pile of nonsense. And therefore, anybody with a curious mind will go and seek this out from another outlet, from either an independent one, if they have to, and tragically, they have to go to an international sometimes to get the real story. That's actually tragic in my view. They should not have to do that. But it's a farce. I mean, it's an absolute farce. I mean, I was trying to think of a good example. I mean, not the Soviets, but I mean, where the whole coverage is dictated by the president's palace. We all know that. I mean, just come on, stop. You might as well replace the news program with a cartoon, because anybody with a curious mind will go, and there are now so many places you can go, will go off and find out exactly what's going on here. So generally is to not be, I know it's if you live there, it's difficult because they know where you live. The worst they can do with us is deport us, or lock us up for a few days. But when you live there, it's really, really hard. But once it's a two-way thing. Is once the people in power actually realise that it's better to have a credible news media than it is to have one that works like a puppet, then you might actually get somewhere. It sounds arrogant to say it, but it's just, I mean, if I'm just trying to think, I mean, the best example at the moment is Russia, where, everything, it's almost like a parody news. I mean, the principal news show there is called Vremya, Channel 1 Russia. If you can get to a place where it hasn't been blanked off, then it's a parody. I mean, because you see what's happening in Ukraine, everything else, how it's been reported elsewhere, and then watch this absolute parody show where nothing went wrong. It's a farce. So the way to do it is slowly. The way to do it is carefully, but the way to do it is to do it definitively.
Okay. So next question is from Ghazal. She's asking how can we maintain ethics and what ethical considerations we can take to report war evidence into AI through media or design communication.
Ethics, okay, the ethics don't change. I mean, it's quite hard. Our job is to realistically be impartial observers. So we're not campaigners. There is emerging a branch of journalism which is more campaigning, But generally, on the mainstream media, is that we are not campaigners. Is that if we are, we have to leave that at the door. I worked for a time with people from Syria in what's called the exiled media in Turkey. And we had great difficulty with this because, again, you're dealing with people who have first-hand involvement. So they have left, they have, for whatever reason, they have relatives who've left behind and they can draw their family tree and a lot of it is missing. So therefore they have, I would describe it as skin in the game. However, to be able to report it, you have to leave that to one side. And so, okay, this happened. Now I need you to go and talk to the government in Damascus about this. And they have to do it because otherwise, how can you claim this is a balance? They're just going to deny everything. So what? You still have to do it. Where it becomes an issue is, okay, is where you stop becoming a journalist and then become a campaigner. Now it's a completely different thing. So you're not asking people to look at your work as reporting as a first draft of history or whatever. You're asking them to look at it from one point of view, and that you're at this point you're a campaigner. So yes, there is a place for that, and I'm not denying that at all. But then we have to be quite clear what we're doing here. Are we doing this to report news to people? Are we doing this to particularly emphasise one point of view? And so, the role of a reporter is to get all sides of the story and to then allow the audience to make up its mind. I mean, in Syria, it's really, you would have to go through the motions with the regime in Damascus. But it would just be, you could almost repeat the same statement every time, but you had to do it. And again, you'd see this statement, you just laugh. I mean, it was nothing to do with us. Well, yes, it was, because you could see your helicopters there. It doesn't make sense. But once we cross into campaigning, then it's something different. Then the ethics have gone. It doesn't mean not to do that. I mean, you may get something that you feel passionately about, but certainly on our side of the business is that we would then say, okay, you can't. This is now opinion editorial. It's not reporting, and that should be the vehicle that you use. And therefore, let's say, for example, you have people who are doing op-eds. As a publisher, I'm then duty bound to get an op-ed from somebody who opposes that viewpoint at some point to publish it. So yes, there is, it is changing in that point, but you have to remember balance is key.
Okay.
The AI bit I didn't get to. The AI bit, by the way, doesn't come into it. Because we're getting confused here as to what AI actually is. It's a lot of statistical stuff. It can help you rewrite, it can help you contextualize, it can't help you balance.
Okay, so last question is, what sort of generic conversation we can use of our war as a heated conflict or a mixed with political changes in our reporting when we want to highlight certain issue?
Sorry, just run that by me again. What specific? I missed part of the question. Sorry.
Okay, so what sort of generic question we can use for war as a heated conflict or mixed with political changes in our reporting when we want to highlight certain issues?
I don't understand about the idea of generic. There's no such thing as generic question or point. It's just go straight to the point. So is to go straight in and not muck about. So it's just straight to the question you want to ask. I know what you mean. It's kind of leading up to the point. Now straight to the point. Like, why did you do this? What's going on here? It's just I've worked in most of the parts of the world where you're from, and I know exactly what you mean. Is like, how do you build up to making that point? Now it's just straight. People think it's not polite. That we have to slowly, but no, just straight. What's your problem? And it's people are not expecting it, but they are really. It's just be direct, straight in, no messing around. It's the deference to authority is something else as well. I know it's a cultural thing in some places, but I mean, we're really bad at this. Is that, if you talk to myself and my colleagues, we do not care who, the other person in front of you is a human being, right? They're no more important than you. They're no different to you, and always treat them that way, and you can't go wrong. Because people, like excellency stuff that, get them straight into it. The more direct, the more pointed you are, the faster you are at getting to the answers.
Thank you, sir. So as we have reached towards the end of this webinar, I would like to thank all the participants for joining us today. We hope the participants must have learned the meaningful lessons from sir. With his diverse experience, we hope that they also understood the role of satire in war reporting and explored the impact of AI on journalism and media. And they must have learned the best practices in media training and broadcasting. A special thank to Sir Neil, who shared his valuable time and expertise with us. We really learned so much from you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to connect with you in future.
Thank you.